Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of this session is fuel choices, fuel mix. What is the right fuel mix? What are the trade-offs? This is an issue of great strategic importance, sometimes more than we even realize. When a country like Iran, for example, decides to do a little bit of a fuel switching from its current energy mix and add nuclear power, the whole world cares about it. It becomes a big issue. When China decides to shift its energy mix from coal to natural gas, and that leads it to create a major energy alliance with Russia, that is an issue of great importance to the world. When Europe decided to switch away from certain types of fuels like nuclear power, coal, fracking, and to focus on renewable energy, and in the process become dependent on Russia, that is an issue that we read about in the news now every day. So the decisions that countries make on fuels, on their fuel mix, are of great strategic importance. We have to understand that this is not only about the pie, the energy pie, it's also about the creation of new industries, new commodities. When the world started using nuclear power, we started using uranium. Now when we're moving to renewable energy, we see more and more of this. That will create new demand for new energy commodities, lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, tantalum, things that are not on our radar screen but will be as we move into the future, including the countries that own them and trade in them. So this is a very strategic issue, and of course, every source of energy, as we've heard today, has its pros and cons, and there are always trade-offs. I would add that it's not only about the balance of the commodity or the balance of the different fuels, it's also about the balance between the consideration, or what we call the energy trilemma, economic security, energy security, environmental security. All of these things need to be taken into consideration in order to create the right balance. The last comment before we open it for the discussion is that when we talk about fuel choice, we have to remember that there are two different types of fuel, of energy systems. One is one that we have talked about a lot today, which is electricity. And when we talk about electricity, we talk about the usual suspects: coal, natural gas, nuclear, solar, wind, hydro. And the other one is transportation, which is almost entirely oil. Now, the interesting thing is, if we look at the past 40 years, how we as a global community have fared, how have we performed in terms of fuel diversification, we have done pretty well when it comes to electricity. We've added new sources of electricity. We've moved from a system of primarily coal, oil, and hydro. We added nuclear, we added renewables, we added now natural gas in large quantities. When it comes to transportation, we have made barely any movement. 40 years ago, we were almost 100% dependent on oil, and today we are again almost 100% dependent on petroleum. So I'd like to ask our panelists today to also relate to those two areas, because the two areas are very important, each for a different reason. How we can open up, add new options, and there are some very interesting ideas that I've heard before from some of our colleagues here. So let us start with Exxon, which is one of not only a supporter of this session, but also and for which we thank you, but also sort of sees this from the industry development, having strong holdings in almost all of the energy sources and markets except for nuclear, right? I know that Exxon, people don't know it, but also is a fairly large holder of coal reserves too. So I think that maybe we start with this and then move to Japan, which is grappling with the issue of its own energy balance, and move down the road to the Middle East, maybe perspective from Europe, and then we do another round of conversation.
Thank you, Gal. Yes, I mean, perhaps I could frame the discussion a little bit here in terms of, the key question you raised to start with is what does the future energy mix look like? That's, I think, a key question. And obviously, we're facing some significant energy challenges, and perhaps the other question that we'll touch on as we chat some is that how can making kind of economies and energy markets more interconnected help us with our shared goals of growing economies and managing emissions. But I think any kind of meaningful discussion of energy needs to start with the recognition, the fundamental recognition that energy is fundamental to humankind, and that it is directly linked to economic growth. That's really is fundamental. And of course, this question of how we grow our economies and how we manage our emissions, how we supply sufficient energy to the world, and at the same time manage emissions is a question that's, for a company like ExxonMobil, is very much core to our mission. And it's a question that we examine each year in our outlook for energy. From a business and policy making perspective, it really is important we get our mind around that topic. And as we think about that challenge, we need to think about how energy is consumed. We need to think about what the supply-demand trends are in the energy markets. And we need to think about the future, what the future may hold for all of the nations in the world that are seeking growth and progress. And what we see out there is growth. We see population growth, we see economic growth, and of course we see energy demand growth. Population in the world today is 7 billion people. It'll grow to about 9 billion people by 2040. And of course, because of energy demand growth, because of increased trade and development, global energy demand is probably going to grow by about a third to 2040. And I think as everyone in this room recognizes, a lot of that driver is happening here in the dynamic economies of the Asia-Pacific region, where I think we believe that the entire Asia economy is likely to triple by 2040, and energy demand is probably going to increase by about 60%. So I think from a business and industry perspective, the need in front of us is clear. We need to be able to make the necessary investments in capital, in time and technology to meet this growing energy demand, and at the same time do this in an environmentally safe and environmentally responsible way. And I think for us, that challenge demands kind of market-based policies that enable industry to invest, to plan and invest over very long time frames that provides that stability that's needed to recover shareholders' investments, and that encourages the technology and the cooperation and the trade needed to direct resources efficiently and to maximize value. So in short there, I think that markets, if they're allowed to work, can help us with that challenge. And I think I think can also help us manage emissions. From the focusing just on the fuel mix going forward, what's that ideal fuel mix that will help us with our dual desire to grow economies, manage emissions? I think we believe that going forward, we're going to need all the sources of energy that are out there in order to meet that growing energy demand. We see a growing role for alternative energy sources, renewable energy sources, in what will be an evolving energy mix. In fact, we believe that alternative energy sources will grow by about 60% through 2040. But coal, oil, natural gas will remain the predominant energy supply sources through 2040. Natural gas, we expect, will be the fastest growing major energy source through 2040, and will surpass coal probably around 2025 as the second largest global energy source. So as we look at that, we think about the supply. What's the supply look like on the gas side? And the IEA estimates over 28,000 TCF of global remaining gas resources in the world today. And that's about 200 years of current annual consumption. And what's amazing about that number, that 28,600 TCF, is it's double what it was estimated at just back in 2000. And of course, that's because of technology developments in recent years that have allowed us to unlock both unconventional and conventional resources around the world. So as natural gas plays an increasingly significant role in the global energy mix and starts to displace coal in power generation, we see significant potential for emissions reduction because, of course, natural gas is a cleaner burning fuel than coal, producing 60%, up to 60% less emissions than coal when used in power generation. So if we let these markets work, they potentially can really help us on both dimensions. And I think the other thing is, as gas's role in the global energy mix increases, it is also creating new trade linkages and new connections between economies. Not only does it help producing nations to become significant exporters, but trade in LNG is underpinning global growth and future demand in importing countries. And of course, Asia Pacific, is particularly well positioned to benefit from that trade, increased trade in natural gas, and the rebalancing of supply from around the world. So if I was to kind of leave you with one key message in all of this, is that we can meet the challenge of growing our economies and managing our emissions, but we need to embrace markets to do that, and we need to encourage greater interconnection between nations, greater trade, and resist the temptation to mandate an energy solution. I think the evolving story of natural gas is a clear reminder of the power of markets to help us in that shared goal of growing economies and managing emissions.
You remind me, there is something that I hear very often in many countries now. It's called an energy policy of all of the above. And then comes a but. All of the above, but not this, not that, and each country with its own but. So, and I think maybe that's a good segue to Japan, which is also wants all of the above, but nuclear power. And maybe Mr. Toyota can also talk to us about who makes the decision, how a decision about the fuel mix is made, by whom, by public, by government.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here to discuss energy mix because Japan is now in the middle of making the energy mix new one. And so I hope we could learn from the discussion today. I think for Japan, the biggest challenge at this moment is to avoid letting political consideration or emotional consideration override scientific or objective judgment. And I am saying this because we had an accident on nuclear, and clearly people lost the confidence on safety authority and tend to be emotional. I think what we can do, or what we should do, is to take a step-by-step approach to find the best energy mix. First, we have to have a sort of standpoints to think about the best energy mix. In the case of Japan, it is 3E plus S. I think 3E, all of you understand that. But plus S means safety. And in light of those four standpoints, we look at the merits and demerits of respective energy, coal, gas, oil, nuclear, renewable. And then, I think coming to your question, the third step is to share these information with the general public. I think probably before 3/11, the Japanese public had a lot of trust on the government and authority, and so they try to understand what the government is trying to say. But now the confidence is quite seriously damaged, and so we have to create our own energy mix, best energy mix, in cooperation with the general public. So the process should be quite transparent and try to let the information shared by the general public. And so, in short, to answer your question, I think now it's sort of a cooperative exercise between the government and the general public. I think that because of that, the committee, advisory committee to the minister has been established, and the discussion is broadcasting to everybody if you want. And so I think now it's a cooperative exercise between the government and the general public. And what sort of energy mix is good for Japan? Still, there is no answer yet. But I think in light of 3E plus S, for Japan, which doesn't have any meaningful amount of energy inside Japan, all the energy are not perfect. All of them have problems in terms of energy security, in terms of economic efficiency, which means cost, and in terms of environment and safety. And so at this moment, perhaps the important way to look at is a balance or diversity among those important fuels, oil, gas, and coal, nuclear, and renewable. If we try to heavily on a particular energy, I think problem would occur. But increasingly, if we think about the future, increasingly the importance of environmental aspect is going to be important one. And so perhaps zero emission energy is more important than others, but I think the fact is that the majority of energy is still fossil fuel, and how we could deal with it. I think two things. One is to promote the cleaner use of fossil fuel, no doubt about that. But I think the utmost way to have a clean use is to convert fossil fuel, oil, gas, and coal, into hydrogen, and by using CCS, we could do capture carbon and store. In addition to that, perhaps the technology, something like CCU is also needed. CCU means coal and capture and use. So we could capture coal, capture carbon, and convert into organic products. I think artificial photosynthesis is something like that. And then, again, we could take advantage of abundant existence of coal, gas, and oil. And so technology matters. But at this moment, this CCU is not yet available. And so again, we have to look back at 3E+. Yes. I think maybe I had better stop here.
Well, maybe that's a good segue to the United Arab Emirates, because that's sort of a country, a small country, that is really opening up to new sources. We've heard this morning from Masdar, but also maybe people are less familiar with the nuclear program. So there you have new sources. What drives this decision? Why? What's the rationale for a country that has so much oil and gas to go nuclear? And how is the decision made in a country like this?
Okay. First of all, for me, what I can see is the future energy of each country has to be tailored by the country itself, based on the trilemma, based on the security, energy security, based on the availability, affordability of the energy and the environmental sustainability. So each country will develop its energy mix based on the available natural resources, based on the technology, available technology, and the commitment with regard to the climate change. In United Arab Emirates, we have made the decision last decade to go for diversification of energy resources. Yes, we are an oil supplier to the world, and we are 10% of production of OPEC, of the oil. But we have a commitment to exporting also the oil to the world. We have a demand growth of nearly 7% on a continuous growth of 7%. So we were in a position to make a decision on continuing our exporting to the world and meeting our demand, our growing demand on energy. Our government decided to go for the diversification of energy resources. This decision has not only been limited for nuclear. This is including the energy, the renewable energy, and the energy efficiency. So we thought, and we agree with IEA that the energy efficiency is the source number one for energy. And so there was a study, we conducted different studies to decide economic and environmental on different type of resources and security of supply of those resources. With UAE, we found out that the best choices to achieve our target of 24% clean energy by 2021 is to invest in solar and in nuclear. We are planning.
When you say to invest, you're talking the government is making the investment, or is it private sector driven?
For nuclear, it is the government.
The government is buying a nuclear power plant?
Yes.
Okay.
And of course, making this decision, with this decision and how to get the society acceptance, there was a plan of how to communicate this to the society, and there was no objection from the society. There is actually annual forum for the society to talk about the nuclear and if they have any clarification, anything, especially that we have selected a site that is far from actually the population.
Okay, Lord Oxborough, you come from a country where people actually want to secede and start their own country, and And there is a very intense debate about some very formative policies that could really change the fuel mix in the UK. Tell us a little bit about what's going on and how the public opinion is shaping this.
Well, the UK, I think, like any country, is subject to a range of different pressures in these matters. And I think it's true not just of the UK, but of every country, that your trade-offs in your future fuel mix is actually going to be a complex function of technology, existing natural resources, economic factors, and indeed social factors. And I think if any technologist thinks he can solve this problem, I think he's going to be very unhappy indeed. Just for an example, I mean, in the UK and probably in other countries, there are people who go apoplectic at the thought of windmills. Other people have a similar response, for example, to nuclear plants and so on. So I think both economic and social pressures are going to be in play here. And you quite rightly before raised the question of who makes the decision. Well, it depends on the decision. Some decisions are clearly made at a governmental level. Some decisions are effectively made by the electorate, who say that they don't particularly want this or don't particularly want that. I think that if I can broaden the question a little bit, simply to raise some questions which I think haven't quite come out yet, there is one resource which you don't hear much discussed at meetings like this, but the one resource which every country has, particularly developed countries, is garbage. And most garbage is roughly 50% organic material. And from organic molecules, you can extract the energy. And we are simply mad to put this material into landfill and things of that sort. There was a calculation which I have not tried to verify, but was done by someone whom I respect, who said the organic content of US garbage, if you were able to extract the energy from the potential energy from that, would be sufficient to actually drive the whole of the US automobile fleet in any one year. Now, obviously it's ridiculous, obviously you can't get all that energy out, but it gives you some sort of feeling for the size of this resource. And it's not something which the traditional energy companies have really thought about very much. But this can be gasified, it can be combusted directly, it can be gasified and turned into a liquid fuel for transport or what have you. So there really is an enormous possibility here. The other technology which has not been discussed today is underground gasification of coal. Questions about coal use came up. And if you take this technology, which has actually been running for decades, particularly in the old Soviet Union, in which you actually combust coal underground in an oxygenated, it's rather like oxyburn for fuel generation, but in a controlled atmosphere, you can produce a gas which you can put directly into turbines. So there is a range of possibilities which have been run for some time, but which have not got much attention. Finally, I would think that there are really there are alternatives. If people don't like nuclear, there is almost no possibility of hitting the climate change objectives unless you have carbon capture and storage. I mean, the numbers we saw that in the talk over lunchtime. The numbers won't work. On the other hand, if you are prepared to go with nuclear, you can actually manage with much less CCS, you can manage with less traditional fossil fuels. And I think the area of nuclear that is certainly getting a lot of attention in Europe, and indeed I believe in the US, are these small modular nuclear reactors. A few, perhaps a couple of 100 megawatts or even smaller. And there is, of course, quite a lot of experience of small nuclear reactors which have been gained in the military area, but also in the civil area, but for propulsion at sea. And people know how to work these things and to keep them safe. And certainly in the West, the safety record of small reactors, is very good indeed. The Soviet Union didn't have quite as such a good record, but again, they're not bad. So I think that I would say some of the components that you have to think of for your future fuel mix is possibly underground coal gasification, small modular nuclear, and don't waste the massive resource that is there in garbage.
Great. Before we move to Arthur Hanna, I want to wrap up the nuclear issue. One thing we need to realize when we decide to phase out, effectively what is happening in Europe is phasing out of nuclear, is that essentially what we are saying that the future of nuclear is going to be in China and Russia. The balance of power on all things nuclear is going to move there. That's where the knowledge is going to be. Your small modular reactors will be developed there and not in the traditional nuclear countries, because that's where the faculties are going to be, the engineering schools, etc. So when we look at it, we need to also understand that there is a broader issue. Where is going to be the future of nuclear technology in the next 100 years or so? Arthur, please. We talked before about subsidies. I think it's a very important issue to raise here, because that's one way that the government can steer and pick and choose what's going to be the fuel mix like.
Very good. Well, actually, before I talk about anything to do with subsidies, let's go back to garbage and nuclear. And the reason I pick on these two is that when I first started working in the industry, the energy industry, back in the very early 80s, we were predicting in most of the books that were being written about the economics of energy that nuclear would be a dominant source of future in our energy mix. And clearly, circumstances and events have happened to make that less likely, albeit, as Laura mentioned, there are opportunities as we go forward. And returning to the issue of garbage, I think what this heralds is that a lot of our discussion today is a recognition that the 21st century energy system that we are working in today and we will transition to will very much evolve to a very different ecosystem of potential supply sources. And when we think about the challenge of balancing, we both have to look at the supply and obviously the demand issues that we're grappling with. From a supply point of view, we've moved from the assurances that potentially there were a limited number of choices available to us, whether that was oil or gas, coal or nuclear. Actually, what we're ending up, and it depends obviously on a country-by-country basis, is that we have multiple choices available to us. And this is one of the complexities, whether we're in Japan, the UK, or any country, is that portfolio demands some choice to be made, either by the market or by policymakers. But the complexity of that choice is getting ever more complex certainly over the last 10 years, and the predictability of those choices is very hard for anyone in this audience to actually hand on heart claim they would have a view on that. So I do think as we go forward, there is more complexity from more energy sources that we need to be thinking about. From the demand point of view, I return to your point about the fact that there is no competition for transportation fuels. Accepted, there might not be. But actually, one of the things that we've seen over the last 10 years has been the efficiency of the internal combustion engine. And we've seen over the last 10 years a progression in energy efficiency as a means by which, obviously, we're now getting more miles per gallon from that fleet, which is changing. In certain countries, we are already talking about peak petrol in terms of the amount of gasoline that is used as a consequence of that. And I do think with LNG as well, we're seeing LNG obviously as a source in the marine fleets, and we are seeing obviously increasing use of LNG as well, and gas in certain transportation fleets as well. So when we think about the actual demand side of things, I think one of the points that we haven't really talked about today is the whole issue of energy efficiency and energy management, which I think is an absolutely critical component. But one of obviously the biggest distortions with regard to the demand side is the issue of subsidy. And the IEA has obviously done a lot of work on this in recent years in its World Energy Outlook. But here in ASEAN, obviously, with subsidy relevant in many, many of the countries, there have been movements in recent times, literally in recent months. In Malaysia, obviously the election pledges in Indonesia, et cetera, are all part of this movement of recognizing that subsidy as a means of allowing the populace to access energy is a rather blunt instrument at best. And as a result of that, increasing talk with regard to smart subsidy as we go forward. So it's about the absolute requirement for us to recognize that we have choices, that there will be a new ecosystem that will emerge with many players we don't even understand today that will be much part of the supply side. On the demand side, I think energy efficiency plays a key role. And on top of that, I do think we need to recognize the distortion that subsidy plays within the supply side. Now, underpinning all of this, I believe, is the issue of energy policy. Because one of the things, obviously, that interferes and or accelerates an ability to access new sources of supply or new criteria as far as demand is the pace at which policy is able to actually keep pace with the enormous changes that we've seen in the energy mix over the course of the last 10 years. I think the other complexity on policy is that when the Undersecretary and myself were in Colombia last week, we were at the World Energy Congress, and one of the debate topics was the nexus of energy, land, and water. In other words, when we look at the earlier comments today by the Minister, and I gave up counting when he got to 15 initiatives that were taking place here in Singapore in terms of the new think tanks, thinking initiatives that are needed to actually move us to the 21st energy system. That was just potentially in the world of energy. When we add to that the issues of land and we add to that the issues of water, it just obviously, exemplifies the issue of the complexity of policymakers actually putting forward policy and regulation that helps us move on that journey as we go forward. So for me, it is about issues about the ecosystem, it's about issues of demand management, but it's also underpinned by how advanced is policy making and how capable is policy in terms of moving us in the right direction towards that 21st century energy system.
There is a fundamental difference between the transportation story and the electricity story in the sense that, okay, when I buy a light bulb or my iPad doesn't care when I charge it whether the electrons were made from nuclear power, from solar power, or from coal. It is commodity agnostic. However, our cars are not commodity agnostic. They're made and certified and warranted to run on nothing but petroleum fuels. Okay, so there is a sort of inherent legacy problem here that prevents competition from taking place in the transportation sector, which essentially keeps oil as the only player in this sector. And it doesn't really allow fuel switching the way we can see in the electricity sector. And we see that there are some wonderful cases of very rapid fuel switching that happens in electricity. Within a few years, a country can move from, can change its energy mix. The question is, what is it we can do in the transportation sector that can do to it what happened in the electricity sector to enable fuel switching? And I'm raising it because there's a lot of questions here about Asia and Singapore, and I want to bring it to the region. This region, Asia Pacific, is the home of 50% of the world's manufacturing capacity of automobiles. It's interesting. So 50% of the world's cars are made here in this region. So this region has something to say when it comes to transportation fuels. If this region, the car makers in China, Japan, Korea, etc., will keep on making cars that can run only on petroleum, that means that for the foreseeable future, we will be tied to petroleum. If the automakers of the region will perhaps with the support and cooperation of the United States, also a major manufacturer, and maybe other Europeans, will open the vehicle platforms to competition, we could see a much more diversified energy portfolio in which we see fuels made from natural gas, coal, biomass, et cetera, electric vehicles. So I think we have to sort of look not only at the commodities themselves, but also at the technologies that prevents them or enable them to compete. Lots of questions here about pricing, and I want you to relate to it, particularly when it comes to the externalities that go into pricing, because we spoke before that if we lifted all the subsidies, the situation will look a little bit different, but we have all kind of policies, subsidies, and others that are to a large extent reflecting externalities. What is the role of externalities in pricing? Should it be part of the defining factor behind our fuel mix? Maybe, Peter, you want to take a dive into this? Because
well, whatever about pricing, I'd say about pricing, the markets always decide the pricing, so I comment on prices per se, but I would step back and maybe talk a bit about cost. And certainly, you know, when we talk about the fuel mixes, we were mentioning, you know, there can be national kind of answers to that problem, each country looking at its own individual situation. And I understand that, but I think it's clear that, you know, international trade has really been the bedrock of our energy industry, and I think future growth will very much be built on strong international partnerships. I mean, the LNG trade, which you know, certainly from the gas world is really the trade that is really connecting the globe, has been built on strong international partnerships. You know, it was those partnerships that kind of helped develop the LNG industry and has made LNG available to the world. And now, today, you know, there are significant volumes of LNG coming from, you know, major suppliers like Qatar, and then new projects coming on just recently from PNG and Australia and the US all coming into the fold. So, you know, that LNG trade is providing enormous flexibility for countries, and also providing that energy security, you know, that drives prosperity, not only for Asia, but I think for the rest of the world. But when we think about the LNG industry today, there's clearly, you know, I spoke about the abundance of natural gas. There's a whole lot of LNG projects that are being tabled out there to come into the market, and the US is a good example of that, where there's a long list of projected projects. So there's certainly the desire of the industry to provide commodity into the market, if you like, to have that connected across nations to help them with their energy mix, make that right solution, but do it from a global perspective as opposed to a national perspective. But the costs are the costs, you know, when we step back from the costs today, you know, I think there's around 80 million tons per annum of LNG capacity under construction in the world right now. And the average cost of a project there, which includes the upstream and the downstream, is probably about $20 billion per project. That's about quadruple the cost of a project that was built in the 2000 to 2010 type frame. So we're certainly seeing an increase in cost for a variety of reasons. And then just the overall capacity of the industry to develop these resources is also been stretched. You know, if we look at the rate of build necessary to meet the projected LNG demand in the world, then we're going to have to be building projects at a pace of about 6 times the rate we saw in the 1990s and almost double the rate we saw in the 2000s. So there's a lot of pressure there from a cost perspective, and of course that cost needs to get reflected then ultimately in the commercial terms that are agreed. So I think certainly from a natural gas perspective, I think there's great opportunity out there. It will play an important role in the mix and can be cost competitive for relative to the alternative power generation and provide you that opportunity for emissions reduction I was talking about.
Thank you. Mr. Kazu?
Yes, I think the issue of price and subsidy, this is quite important. I think there could be good subsidy and bad subsidy to somehow affect the price level. First, we have to think about energy mix, and in the case of Japan, we would have quantitative goals in terms of energy mix, and EU has 20-20-20 or 45-27-27. And having decided that, and then some sort of subsidy could be provided to move people, companies to that goal. But clearly, the problem with subsidy, particularly, I think people say some bad subsidy, that to discourage promotion, to discourage energy conservation and distort the best use of energy toward energy mix. Appropriate energy mix. And so feed-in tariff is a sort of subsidy. And if you try to promote renewable energy, it might be one way to go. But if you make the tariff so high, the problem would occur maybe in Germany and now in Japan. And so I think when we say price or subsidy, we had better somehow differentiate good subsidy and bad subsidy. And on the issue of transportation energy mix, I think it's getting more and more possible for us to think about various transportation energy. Yes, oil, and now natural gas, and it's increasingly possible to have hydrogen. So I think now we can think about the energy mix in terms of transportation energy as well. And so I think things are getting more interesting, and innovation can be needed here. Thank you.
Lord Oxburgh, you mentioned before the concept of underground gasification of coal. I want to talk to you a little bit about the unconventionals, because one of the things that happened in recent years with the North American shale revolution, we all sort of took a pause. We were surprised by how fast and aggressive a new source of energy can surface and ignite the whole world. Do any of you have a sense of what could be the next frontier? Maybe methane hydrates? Is that something that sparks your imagination? Anybody has some thoughts about what's the next surprise?
There are an awful lot of methane hydrates around in the deep oceans, but I think it's actually quite hard to see a way of exploiting them safely at present. That doesn't mean it can't be done, but I would not say it was on the immediate horizon. I think, as you mentioned, underground coal gasification is probably significantly nearer. And given the coal reserves that there are around the world and the hostility to burning them in conventional power stations and all that goes with that, I think I could see that as something which expands. The other thing, of course, is that there is a lot of coal around which can't be mined today. It could have been mined 100 years ago when people went underground with picks and shovels, but underground mining today is highly mechanized, and what it can't really deal with is fault seams, with coal seams which are faulted and shifted and messed up. Gasification underground can cope with that pretty well. So I think that this is actually is going to be a serious possibility. And to go back to the conversation of a minute or two ago, I mean, it is worthwhile recognizing that the only reason that some of the unconventionals are not, or indeed renewables, are not cost effective by comparison with fossil fuels, is that the fossil fuels have not been paying their externalities. If you really, I mean, how you judge this is an interesting question, but really until you have some sort of universal carbon tax, which says actually burning fossil fuels is doing damage to the global commons, and you need to pay for that so that we can do something about it, you're not going to get proper parity between quite a few renewables and fossil fuels.
Universal carbon tax, you're saying? That's the...
Yeah.
Okay, we need a universal government first, I guess.
Absolutely.
Hopefully a benevolent one. Anybody wants to jump in about
Yeah.
what is next? Please.
I think, yes, if you look into the countries who has decided to stop the nuclear, they are going for coal. So the opportunity for coal and the technology of clean coal development will be the trend in the future for the countries who has decided to stop their nuclear generation. This is from the coal side. With regard to transportation, we have to differentiate between the vehicle, the car, and the public transportation. I think there is a linkage between the solution for transportation diversification and with electricity. For public transportation, for metros, there is electrical metro. There is a trend for, so any solution with regard to transportation, it will be also affecting the electricity consumption. That will go for, the diversification of energy resources.
I think, one of the things that, if we're talking about the future and the choices, is that we still need to recognize that there are over 1 billion people who don't have access to energy. So we can be talking about potential choices that might be attractive to the developed world. But in the developing world, I think actually what we heard earlier today, a little bit about off-grid solutions in terms of the advancement of microgrids, the advancement in the way that solar could be used associated with that, I think is very exciting in terms of the way in which we think about the way in which energy is accessed securely to a much broader populace in some of the developing world as we go forward. I do think, as the IEA have mentioned, is that this whole issue of energy efficiency is really important to look at. For the first time, we have a decoupling of GDP growth with the oil intensity associated with that. Up until literally 5 or 6 years ago, it would have been a correlation, very close correlation between the two. And we have seen that gradual decoupling. And I think when we look at that going forward, that for me is a major development because that whole energy efficiency area is something we need to consider because it fundamentally changes the models by which we think about balancing as we go forward, coupled with looking at broader means by which we access energy to a large part of the population in the world today.
Okay, we have 2 minutes. I want to choose the most popular question by far. I think almost every person in the room sent you the same question about Singapore, and we owe it to Singapore for wonderful hospitality. Singapore's fuel source for electricity is 90% natural gas. How can Singapore improve its fuel diversity? Quick suggestions for Singapore. 90% is a lot. It's very heavily dependent on one source.
Well, if I may, it's one source, but multiple sources, if that makes sense. In other words, gas doesn't come from one source.
Right.
It comes from multiple different sources. And the key thing here is portfolio choice and minimizing your portfolio risk in the wide variety of sources that actual gas can come from. So I think as much as we say it's one source, it is in fact a multitude of sources that actually is available to the state of Singapore as we go forward. I think the other issue that was mentioned earlier that the Minister mentioned is obviously solar. We are moving towards a kind of zero marginal cost of photovoltaic. Will happen at some stage over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. And the key challenge there will be the integration of that into the existing grid, which again, we've heard all of the challenges of that earlier this morning.
Anything on?
Just very quick comment. Japan is very similar to Singapore. Well, 99% energy is imported, and but we understand that all kinds of energies are not perfect in terms of energy security, economic cost, and environment. And then I think Mr. Minister this morning said he wouldn't rule out the possibility of introduction of nuclear. I think that's quite sensible position. It's better to have a sort of variety of various kinds of energies. And so it may take some time, but it's better to think about the future energy mix and try to make efforts to move that direction. So the balance might be another watchword today. Thank you.
We just ran out of time, and before I close, I just want to mention here that since we did not talk in detail about transportation solution, there will be, as part of the Energy Week, a special roundtable on Thursday on transportation fuel choices for Asia, with experts on a variety of different fuel choices, electric vehicles, natural gas, alcohol fuels, vehicle technologies, etc. So if you're interested in this particular issue, you're welcome to join us. And with it, I could have spent hours with you talking about this issue. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, and we have 2 more sessions to go. So please join me in a round of applause to our panelists who came from all over the world. Thank you very much.